Thank you for having me. I'm going to start from the perspective of what I'm not. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not an expert on banking. I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm not an academic researcher. I'm a dabbler. I dabble in lots of different things. And I've spent 40 plus years observing how businesses and investors behave. And what I've discovered is psychology and perception have a lot more effect on that behavior than economic models. So, as an outsider, I'm going to give you my perspective on what I've seen happen around climate change. And this might not be diplomatic, but might as well cut to the chase. Here's what I've seen over the last 20 years. Climate change is the most publicized, the most warned about, and the most discussed existential crisis that I've ever seen. And you're saying that's merited, that's fine. Second, governments all over the world claim to care about climate change. In fact, every year they gather together in the most recent, the most recent meeting of COP28. Hypocrisy runs rampant in this space. It was said in Dubai. They talk about how they're going to change the world. They set targets that everybody knows will not be met. And I'll guarantee you there'll be a COP29, perhaps in Riyadh, where we will repeat the whole process again. Companies and businesses all claim to be green. They claim to care about the climate. And I'm going to gag the next time I see the words net zero in a company's financial statement, or an airline asking me to pay an extra $40 to see if I want to reduce my carbon footprint. And in this process, they've been aided and abetted by consultants and experts who fed them the buzzwords. And let's face it, ESG is an acronym. It doesn't even merit the notion of an idea or a concept. It's an acronym. Sustainability, just as much of an acronym. And these consultants have told these companies that they can have their cake and eat it too, that they can be green and be more valuable. Investors, same phenomenon. They've pumped in trillions of dollars. Don't tell me enough money hasn't been invested in green spaces. Trillions of dollars. And again, with the promise that they can deliver higher returns while being good. Consumers have been given lots of different ways in which they can show how wonderful they are. They can buy green products. They can invest in green funds. They can misbehave all day and come back home, buy an ESG fund, and say, I'm okay again. But here's, I think, the most sobering reality. After 20 years, trillions of dollars, and all of this talk, if you look at how much of our energy comes from fossil fuels, it's barely budged. In fact, you know that our dependence on fossil fuels decreased more between 1975 and 1995 than it has in the last 20 years. And the reason for that was actually the one alternative energy source that most green energy people claim to hate, which is nuclear energy. Over the last 20 years, our dependence on fossil fuels has gone from 85% to 81.5%. We've reduced dependence by 3.5%, and we paid $10 trillion for that amazing fact. I'll let you do the math on that. If you really want to get the fossil fuel dependence down to 50%, you work out how much it'll cost. This notion that you can get good without sacrifice is the heart of why all of this space is in trouble. I'm not in any position to give you advice on what you should do with your banking, your pension funds, but I'll tell you what I think. I think you got to stop with this apocalyptic stuff. Do you really think telling people that the world will end in 35 years is going to make them behave better? That's like telling somebody they have 60 days to live and say, behave healthfully. It's not going to happen. So even if you believe that the world will end if climate change is not met, telling people that is the worst possible strategy psychologically. Second, remove virtue from this discussion. This notion that if you believe that climate change is before, you're a good person. If you don't, you're a bad person. It's contaminating the discussion. It's making the perfect the enemy of the good. In fact, much of the research, and let's face it, much of the research on ESG and sustainability is not what the paper it's written on. But the research that actually takes a closer look has concluded that shades of gray are better than black and white, that investing in brown innovation is better than investing in green innovation. That accepting shades of grays, I think, incremental change is going to be much more effective than this, hey, if you don't do this, we'll all die. And
Okay, Professor Damadoran, this is a fascinating statement, and I think we're going to have a really good discussion today, but I have to stop you there so that we can go to questions and answers. Okay. and explore these ideas in greater detail. So we'll start with Mr. Mazier for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Damadoran, my questions will be for you today. Are Canadian depositors at risk if the government mandates ESG ratings or climate-related disclosure statements on financial institutions?
It goes back to the heart of what I said, which is sacrifice is at the heart of being good. If you're going to ask banks to do something, you got to ask who's paying for it. Bankers are. It's not coming from bankers' personal wealth. The market cap of the 5 biggest Canadian banks collectively will be a drop in the ocean of the cost of meeting climate change. So if you ask banks to bear this cost, and what I hear when I hear that is you got to lend to green energy companies at below market rates. Because if it's at market rates, you don't need any of this stuff. If you're going to ask banks to do it, guess who's going to bear the cost? It's going to be depositors. Is that really what you want of this process? Acting like banks are these are like the big tech companies with hundreds of billions of dollars to throw around is delusional. So ultimately, if you put strictures on banks, the people who will pay this, and I can almost guarantee you this outcome, will not be bank shareholders, will not be bank managers, it'll be bank depositors.
Thank you.
I thought your role was to protect them.
Thank you. So it goes into my next question. What would be the impact to retirement savings if government forced climate-related disclosures on Canadian pension funds in an attempt to meet the Paris climate targets?
I'll be quite honest. I think I call this disclosure diarrhea. It's happening across the board. Companies, pension funds. You know what the net effect of all of this disclosure is? We get immune to it. We'll have 150 pages. And in fact, if you want truly ineffective legislation, pass more disclosure legislation. It'll actually make people even more immune to debate about climate change because you're going to throw the big stuff and the small stuff into that disclosure. And if in fact, pension funds are required to bear a cost, there again, you got to ask, is this the right group to be bearing that cost?
Will government regulation of ESG scores and climate change disclosure statements on financial institutions have any impact in reducing emissions?
Well, even the ESG services have no idea what ESG measures. ESG is the most diffuse, undefined. It's like nailing Jell-O to a wall. If ESG services have no idea what they're measuring, how the heck are governments going to require companies to follow ESG rules? It's a recipe for disaster again.
So would there be basically no way to reduce or to measure how many emissions are being even reduced?
Well, they can disclose whatever they want, but if you look at the net effect, it doesn't seem to match up. In fact, if you collect up what companies claim they've done, and then you look at the output and say, why isn't it showing up in the results? There's many a slip in the cup and the lip. Disclosing this doesn't seem to show up in the final numbers. And I think that's a question we've got to ask is why after 20 years of forcing companies to disclose this, and more so in the last few years, is nothing changing on the ground?
Thank you. You referred to an ESG gravy train in one of your presentations. Can you explain this term and explain how banks and consultants benefit the most from ESG scores and climate-related disclosures?
BlackRock was very much up in fronter in this ESG train early on. In fact, Larry Fink said the world will not be safe if we don't have ESG. So I took BlackRock's Sustainability Fund, which is a fund built around ESG, and I compared it to their regular fund. Out of the 500 stocks in the regular fund, 497 showed up in the Sustainability Fund. The difference was BlackRock charged 5 times more for the Sustainability Fund than the regular fund. You look at fund managers, you look at bankers, you look at consultants, every one of them has an ESG arm, and the ESG arm makes money by selling this notion to people. And again, with the idea that you can be good and be more valuable at the same time.
Thank you. Does improving ESG ratings or climate-related disclosures increase value or decrease risk in any proven way?
None that I can see of. I've heard, as I said, I've looked at every single research paper in this space. The papers that do are advocacy papers masquerading as research papers. I mean, I live in the value space. That's what I do. I value companies. I'm still to value a company where ESG has made the company more valuable. It can make it less valuable. But when ESG makes a company more valuable, it's because it's PR, it's marketing, at which point you're gaming the system. You're encouraging what you call greenwashing by pushing that idea on companies.
Thank you. You stated in the Financial Times, and I quote, "It serves ESG advocates to keep the definition amorphous since, like the socialists of the 20th centuries, whose response to every socialist failure was that their ideas had never been properly implemented, the defense against every ESG critic is that it is incorrectly defined or implemented," end quote. What did you mean by this?
You have 30 seconds, Professor.
I've had a lot of blowback on that one. The truth is that because ESG measures, you put 100 ESG people in a room, they come up with 100 different definitions. So whatever your critique is, they say, that's not my ESG you're critiquing. Very convenient, but not very, it's not very honest.
Thank you. We'll go now to
Mr. Cram, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. I'll start with Professor Damodaran. Professor, in your opening statement, you talked about how our dependence on fossil fuels increased more from 1975 to 1995 than at any other time because of the adoption of nuclear energy. And you also spoke about I believe you used the term, the hypocrisy of environmental activists and their bias against nuclear energy. Can you explain why this bias may be there in the first place and what some of the benefits of adopting nuclear energy may be?
You're on mute, Professor.
Our dependence decreased because of nuclear energy. I think part of it is, again, this black and white of, you don't accept shades of gray. You are going to put things on one side of the line or the other. And for whatever reason, perhaps because of safety mostly, nuclear energy ended up on the wrong side of the line. And once you get on the wrong side of the line, there is no way back in this space.
de vous interrompre.
Excusez-moi, oui.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Chair. But in terms of nuclear energy, we're talking about sustainable finance. We already had 4 meetings. We have a report on nuclear energy. I don't know why we're coming back to nuclear energy today. They were talking about finance. Yes, but the subject is quite broad, I think. Broad enough so that we can include discussion on nuclear. We will continue. There are 2 minutes left.
Okay.
As I said, in a world of black and white, once you're on the wrong side of the line, there's no way back. And that, I think, is part of my problem, is purists end up putting one type of energy or the other on one side of the line, and we cut off any chance of compromise.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Professor, do companies that adopt ESG policies see higher rates of return compared to companies that do not?
No. In fact, the higher rates of return that high ESG companies have derived has come mostly from big tech companies early in the process being classified as good companies on the ESG space. It's got nothing to do with ESG. It's accidental alpha, as I call it.
And would it be the case that if companies that did adopt ESG policies did see higher rates of return, then all these companies would do it and there would be no need for this committee meeting today? Is that a fair assessment, Professor?
That's exactly right. If ESG and sustainability was so good for your bottom line, why the heck would you need it in the first place? They'd do it anyway.
And also, Professor, in your opening statement, you used the example of being asked to pay $40 to reduce your carbon footprint on a commercial airline ticket. What advice would you have for people the next time they're asked to pay that $40 to reduce their carbon footprint the next time they buy a commercial airline ticket?
You have 30 seconds, Professor.
You'd be out of your mind to pay it. I would not.
And can you elaborate on why that is, Professor?
Because that money might go into planting a tree in Oregon or it might go into somebody's pocket. I think that this is part of the gravy train that I talked about, all that money being collected with very little to show for it.
Merci.